I won't be there. Yeah, I don't go.
Why?
Because I will be in France. Like,
Like 2 hours to come back, right?
yeah, but they will expect me to spend 2 weeks of rent and pay the Eurostar, so £200 just one way, just to attend one lecture.
Yeah, let me see.
And one lecture that
No,
isn't.
no, it's involved in it.
Yeah, even worse. Non, non, en fait, je sais pas, nous on a un cours obligatoire, ok, tu vois. Ouais. J'ai pas pu choisir, c'est obligatoire. Je m'en fous un peu en vrai, tu vois. Mais le truc, c'est que normalement, ils ont décalé ça le 25. Mais moi, j'ai pris mes billets le 12. Moi, je rentre chez moi au calme. Pas avec moi, c'est mais non, même c'est pas grave en fait, si t'es pas là pour moi, je fais rien.
When are you going to use it?
August.
August. You have class in June.
Where?
December.
No, I have class in June.
I thought that you have to do some bridging because you have civil law.
No, civil law, so basically you start around 17 or 18 August. I'm supposed to start on the 3rd. But I will send them a mail, maybe I can go. Because they said, I'm from civil law, yeah, but I'm married, so I'm not familiar with common law. So,
but you will go early anyway to check accommodation.
Accommodation, I might just go to one of my friends. He has his parents, they have several properties in Singapore, and he said maybe I can just stay there. Jason, you live near SMU or no? Oh, wait. 15 minutes, it's close.
You can come my house.
By walk or by
Transport.
MRT? Because I saw one place, but I think it's not by bus. I don't know how reliable the bus is.
Very.
Not like here.
I never take bus here.
Oh, I took it one time. He says I went 5 minutes, 20 minutes later.
Oh yeah.
Pourquoi tu parles anglais? Je sais pas pourquoi tu parles anglais, c'est l'habitude. C'est les mots, ils sont en anglais. C'est trop drôle. C'est la chose avec moi. C'est que, je vois, des fois, je l'ai dit en anglais. On est tous français ici. Mais normalement, en plus, le anglais, c'est plus cher. C'est horrible. Moi, j'ai détesté les mots. C'est comme le truc. C'est plus que je. Là, pour moi, c'est explicite. Parce que les meufs qui font des anyway à Paris, c'est trop. Nous, moi, d'habitude, si on avait une bonne excuse pour les tromper, mais ouais, non, les bus, c'est vraiment bien. Par contre, on a mis le bus, tu sais, frérot, c'est qui ont toujours le bus. C'est que je suis allé, j'ai vu des mecs, littéralement, j'ai vu des mecs qui sont avec des t-shirts dans le bus. J'ai vu des mecs qui fumaient genre au bif, j'ai vu des mecs qui fumaient au weed dans le bus. Ça, j'en ai vu aussi. Après, j'ai l'impression que moi, les gens qui disent ça, mais c'est vraiment genre, tu sais, genre, avoir des braquettes à côté de moi. Le soir, c'est des gens bizarres, tu vois, rentrer, ça. Elle se levait, elle était à ça, elle se levait, elle se piquait, et elles étaient sur la gueule, elles sont installées. Mais elles sentaient un mélange de deux, c'était trop bien en même temps. C'était affreux. Mais tu sais, t'as jamais senti ça, tu vois. Tu sais, une fois, j'ai pris Fauti, tu vois, et des meufs, elles s'assisent pour moi. Je crois que c'était des élèves, un truc genre. Mais vraiment, tu sais, qu'elles buvaient tellement la cigarette et l'alcool, genre, j'allais vomir, vraiment. Vraiment, je vomir. C'est l'aura vraiment de décomposition de la chapelle, la colline du crack, ça rivalise pas. Nous, c'est sur la raison. Enfin, après, ça pose pas mal les vieux fesses. J'avoue, les vieux fesses, ça reste par rapport aux tu sais que par exemple, quand tu vas genre dans l'est de Londres, dans le sud, ou même dans le nord-ouest, tu sais que c'est même pas l'Angleterre, c'est le pays. Tu vas là-bas, mais c'est pas distant.
Okay, but make sense.
Non, mais frérot, nouvelle.
Ouais, mais tu vois, il y a une différence. Parce que là, par exemple, à Londres, quand tu vas à Chinatown, tu vois quand même que t'as Londres. Tu vois, il y a quand même une seconde qui est là parce que c'est safe, parce que tu vas dans les quartiers, c'est un peu plus parce que tu vois.
C'est pas le même équilibre, on va dire.
En plus, souvent, quand tu vas là-bas, tu fais pas de la publicité, tu te fais.
Venez à côté de chez moi, chez mon pote, c'est un voisin. Il y a un moment, il a entendu les bruits, il s'est pas allé à du bâtiment, il est juste au milieu, il était vraiment en face, entre guillemets, de la parenté. Au moment où il a entendu des bruits de danse, parce que les bruits, il a jamais connu, il était chaud, il était comme tu disais, c'est ce type de cancel. Si on encore que Montréal, ça fait un peu voir aussi beaucoup de space par terre, parce que tu sais, vraiment sur le nord, donc c'est pas les limite sur le travail famille, mais c'est pas non, la vie qu'on a
Tu peux parler français, moi, j'ai pas besoin d'acheter des mots.
non, mais je veux dire.
Non, t'as pas besoin d'acheter des mots.
Non, mais. On va dire des abeilles non plus, mais.
Oui, attends, c'est pas factuel.
C'est à peu près des gens qui sont un petit peu zéro. T'as vu les trucs de ma famille, ou alors c'est des trucs, tu vois. T'as fait des espèces de petits magasins, c'est pour faire des virements dans les pays d'origine des gens.
Ça, c'est du blanchiment d'argent, ça.
C'est énormément de mecs sterling. Tu sais, ça peut même tu vois, tu sais vraiment, les mecs, il y a des surtout qu'en plus, les par contre, t'avais l'Empire Mercedes, ils sont bien à côté des maisons. Ça, c'est quoi déjà ça c'est à côté de l'époque et au collège, ils sont parlé là. Dans ce sens-là. Et elle nous disait, à droite, les personnes qui aiment c'est mon fils,
et on fait un seul Somalien qui faut des infos de 16 Finnois. Et tu sais quoi? Tu avais un graphique qui montrait les immigrés qui rapportent plus d'argent. Parmi les immigrés, tu avais des Américains en premier. Les mecs, ils avaient un truc genre, un rapport genre 60 000 Après, tu avais ce qui était asiatique. Les Japonais, ils rapportent 50K, 30K, 40K. Et tu avais littéralement les Somaliens. Moins de 200 000. Genre, un Somalien. Genre, la big, c'est genre le mec, comment c'est possible? Les gens, tu fais perdre de l'argent.
Et surtout, le pire, tu vois, le début, c'est vraiment. Et même les pays en PLF, à partir de la c'est sur
tous les pays en Europe, ils font ça, c'est la politique européenne qui est aura. Ah non, mais toi, t'es parisien ou pas?
Non, je suis pas mais
mais tu, parce que je sais pas si t'as vu les municipales. Les municipales, t'as eu d'autres, tu vas aller voir quelqu'un à Paris. C'est un mec PS. Donc en gros, la vidéo qui a des journalistes en disant pour réunir un mec PS. Mais tu sais quoi le pire? Moi, je suis parisien. Le problème, c'est qu'on a deux chiens. C'est soit des mecs qui sont très moches, c'est soit des mecs qui sont dans l'arrêt qui voient pas les problèmes. Mais le problème, c'est qu'on a des mecs qui tiennent, je croyais, pour quatrième, qui votent à gauche parce qu'ils veulent bien faire sens, mais qui ne voient jamais les répercussions de la politique. Et c'est le gars Emmanuel Devoir, cette politique, vraiment, si tu lis le programme, 70% du programme, c'est quoi? C'est inclusivité, LGBT, accueil des étrangers, accueil des aides. Il n'y a rien. Moi, en tant que parisien, je suis super politique en mer. Mais c'est ça. Il existe. Non mais en fait, on va dire ouais mais les études c'est gratuit. Ah non, ça s'appelle des impôts. C'est comme les mecs qui disent c'est comme
c'est juste nos darons, notamment de ma famille qui ont fait des cours sur c'est évidemment ils étaient moins posés, on avait plus d'école, je sais pas quoi.
Non mais déjà si les impôts étaient moins posés, tu ne peux pas utiliser les taxes parce qu'il y a un truc qui s'appelle l'impôt sur le résultat.
Déjà, tu as un produit sur les revenus. Les revenus que tu as gagnés, tu as déjà payé des impôts. Tu dois les donner africalement, tu dois payer encore plus. Mais c'est
le revenu, le patrimoine, la transmission, l'héritage, ça n'en finit pas.
Mais moi, tu sais que c'est un peu la part, parce que je pense un peu de ça. Mais là, cette année, c'est le sous-stage que tu as fait. les sortir des assurances, ça sur des histoires. Tu vois, parce que j'avais ça, sinon,
Non, j'ai les
c'est la merde. On n'a jamais quelqu'un avec ça. Jamais.
Et tu sais, le pire, c'est quoi? C'est que, par exemple, imagine que tes parents, le mec il développe, la propriété, la valeur, elle va compter comme un revenu. Ça veut dire qu'ils vont demander, imagine, tu refais une valeur, tu revends de 600 000, ils vont dire, ah ouais, mais du coup, vu que, on va dire, allez, par exemple, on va dire, moi, c'est 50 000 francs, tu payes 50 000, mais tu les as pas, du coup, tu es obligé de vendre la propriété pour toucher 250 000. Donc ça veut dire qu'au final, c'est un pitch infini pour les armes.
Bien sûr. Mais en fait, c'est comme ça qu'il y a tous ces soutiens sociaux et de merde et tout en permanence. C'est comme ça qu'il y a des politiques de prix de merde sur ce sujet. Sauf évidemment les gens qui sont apparemment les plus débiles, mais encore les importe.
Bah non, mais les mecs, les mini, je suis désolé, mais c'est pas parce que les débiles, ça veut dire que c'est pas système.
Parce que toi, tu vois, pour moi, les autres, je manque pas d'empathie, tu vois. Mais la merde, les mecs n'arrivent pas à se faire, c'est leur problème. On n'a pas à récupérer leur merde.
Non, mais c'est pas une question d'empathie. Tu sais que moi, les parents, quand ils sont en France, c'est l'année, ils disaient rien. Mon daron, au lieu de se plaindre et de dire qu'il y a une raciste, tu sais, mon daron, il a continué, il a aussi fait des réunions pour la mairie, après il a fait pour la police, il a tout fait.
Mais tu sais, c'est pas les gens BR, ça se plaint, mais ça fait toujours trop. Tu vois pas de blanc, bon, il y a très peu de blancs en France qui sont racistes contre les Asiatiques. Les mecs qui sont racistes contre les Asiatiques.
Après, là, mais c'est pas dans les grosses régions. Moi, je sais que quand je suis en Normandie, quand je suis allé en Normandie,
C'est des jeux, c'est des merdes. J'ai vu mon premier sur racistes contre les Asiatiques, mais aussi chez les gens.
par contre, ce qui est bizarre, c'est que quand tu compares l'intégration des Asiatiques dans notre pays, même des Asiatiques qui viennent de pays, genre limite, c'est la guerre, c'est la famille, donc c'est vraiment qu'on vient au travail.
C'est fou.
Tu sais que moi, quand je suis genre identité, tu vois, mais tu sais que genre, tous mes potes à l'époque de l'université, les mecs, leurs parents, ils sont restés au même stade. Ils sont pas ceux qui ont gardé leur job de merde, c'est personne en fait, parce qu'ils sont dans les étapes plus fortes. Ils aspirent à. Et après, quand ils voient que mes darons, ils sont en mode, ah ouais, t'as de la chance. Va travailler de 5h à 22h, c'est pas tant. Va traiter
Les gens ne comprennent pas, tu vois. En France, c'est vraiment. Et en plus, en France, c'est jamais.
mais déjà, si c'est un bon pour les salaires, tu vas demander le salaire d'un niveau de roi de 250 euros, ça va être moi, je veux dire, j'ai des potes qui sont plutôt 150 j'aurais demandé leur salaire, ils me disent, ah ouais, non, ça dit pas. Comment ça, je pense des millions, et quoi, t'es actionnaire chez Total, pourquoi tu commences à faire le mec? Parce que moi, mon salaire, je m'en fous, moi, je veux que à temps partiel, un rapport de cap, on va aller. Mais
Justement, il y a pas de en fait, ce qu'on c'est ça qui est jeune.
mais il suffit de voir, t'as des belles voitures que tu vas dehors,
Mais moi, personnellement, c'est tout même un truc peut-être, mais je sais pas si on va peut-être des trucs de français, c'est les directs sur les gens qui font tout moche. La version décapotable de cette pièce-là, moi j'en ai eu pendant un an, mais là, ça a eu pendant 6 mois. Donc oui, je me suis dit, non, j'ai l'impression que c'est un moto, tu vois, c'est ça.
Moi, tu sais, j'avais un moto, et quand j'allais à la fac, j'ai vu dans le moto, quand je conduisais, des mecs qui avaient chopé des épluchures de clémentine. Et dans la chaîne, dans la chaîne. Mais en plus, tu sais, quand j'allais à la fac, je parlais avec mes potes, c'est littéralement, déjà, je me dépose en fil, je me dégoûtais des trucs, c'est-à-dire que les gens ne me connaissent pas. C'est-à-dire que tu connais pas un mec, juste parce que tu vois qu'il y a une autre personne.
Vraiment, c'est uniquement comme ça. C'est compliqué pour moi, c'est ce choix. Enfin, dans notre côté, les âges sont honnêtement, je suis assez d'accord. Je pense que c'est.
De toute façon, moi j'ai la France en 10 ans pour se réveiller après ça. Absolument.
Moi je l'année prochaine, à voir comment les élections l'année prochaine vont se dérouler, ça va être très drôle, je pense.
Soit alors, peut-être la France est un territoire perdu pendant un siècle et après t'as la reconquista comme en Espagne et on verra.
La population, c'est le grand remplacement.
Le grand remplacement.
La population,
Mais t'as pas que des noms à la barre.
mais c'est pas de l'élection française, c'est pas de l'autre. Et enfin, c'est une élection française, c'est ce que la population a été remplacée.
Même en fait, c'est. Mais parce que tu sais, le débat qui est sur les prénoms, c'est un truc métal parce que moi je disais, tu vois, les mots. Moi, à l'époque où il y a dit ça, je sais plus par rapport au prénom. Moi, c'est pas des prénoms. Parce qu'en fait, en quelque sorte, il y a parce que l'identité d'une personne, il y a une famille. Une famille, c'est perpétuel, c'est pas héréditaire. Le prénom, ça ne définit pas qui tu es en fonction de ta famille. Ça veut dire que moi, il pourrait se le principe de Marseille. C'est tout le problème. Non, parce que c'est différent. Parce que la France a un pays fort, donc c'est un pays qui est exportateur de culture. Donc ça veut dire que quand tu es un pays genre l'Algérie, tu ne peux pas te prétendre à imposer ton nom. Alors que par exemple, quand tu, je sais pas, imagine tu as un nom comme Louis, c'est universel. Tu vois, même au Japon, avec ça aussi. Même les Japonais peuvent se tromper. C'est un prénom qui a du flow, voilà. C'est un prénom qui a du flow, c'est comme les Américains, t'as des mecs qui s'appellent John, tu sais pas. En plus, John, c'est un nom de genre. Il y a des noms comme ça, il y a des noms, c'est des noms. Je sais pas, après, je t'appelle Abdou Mohamed,
Oh, 10 minutes. And he could have stopped.
Non, mais non, c'est de la guerre maintenant.
Mais c'est pas ça.
Non, mais non, c'est la guerre. Moi, j'ai vécu à Nantes, déjà c'était de la merde. Moi, j'allais des
Moi, j'ai pas été Nantes, mais j'ai des copains qui ont passé. C'est vraiment ça.
Ideally, I'd like to sign in to my, when I use the email. Can you open the page for that for me?
You can do it.
Email. I think you're going to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Good. That way I can get the slides up in PowerPoint. Right, well, I think of it, there's the attendance code. Can you see that? QJ FHTQ now. Good.
Professor, so Professor Walker asked to record the thing, so like last time, but at each break, you like stop recording and record again. Like basically to divide the record by 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour.
I've no idea what you're talking about. Feel free to set up anything you want to set up. I don't know what to do.
Just I'll do like what Professor Walker
Yeah,
asked.
you just go ahead and do it. Yeah,
He asked me by mail. Oh, maybe you just wanna see how it is now? Yeah, that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, we are. I think I already set up everything.
You ready? All
Yeah.
done, yeah?
The only thing is that he doesn't know how to use Zoom, so it's
Ah,
kinda.
okay. Because I checked the camera for a second, it looked like no one was there. Unless everyone came late. You're supposed to start at 12, no? Ah, okay.
Okay, it's done.
Thank you.
Just ideally, what Professor Walker asked is just like if you can, like just do this, like when we have a break, just pause recording, and then resume.
Well, can you do that?
I mean, yeah, I'll have to come back and forth every time. So,
Is that okay?
I mean, okay.
It's not a long walk, is it?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So as I said to you last week, these set of slides are pretty self-explanatory, a lot of detail in them. But before I move on to the fraud slides, I want to talk about this one for a minute, because in the past, I'm not saying what I'm doing this year, but in the past I had included this in a problem question scenario. I have a policy. If you talk, I don't talk. So when you stop talking, when you're ready to stop talking, I'll talk. Okay. Yeah. In the past, I've said an exam question, problem question style, which has stolen card, internet scanning scenario, but I've chucked this in with it. It's a bit sneaky on me. So in order not to be so sneaky, I'm going to talk about this slide right now because it can get included in the fraud question as a kind of small part. Because this is relevant to credit card use. And normally the issues about credit cards are it gets stolen and misused, but this is a scenario which is quite important where it doesn't get stolen and misused. It's the right person using the card, and so as the slide says, these rules came in the CCA Consumer Credit Act that was passed in 1974. It was so long ago, that's actually when I was a law student. And I remember how exciting it was that this came in, and it was a brand new codifying act which brought in, as I say, it's a codifying act which brought under one heading all the little pieces of consumer protection that applied to the borrowing of money. And one of the social concerns at the time, still is actually, is that vulnerable people who borrow money and use it to buy something which then becomes faulty, actually in contract law terms have two separate contracts: a sale of goods contract with the provider of goods and a loan contract with the provider of the money for the loan. And what would often happen is, and rightly or wrongly, second-hand car showrooms feature strongly in this. We're looking for examples of this kind of problem. But you have, let's say, a second-hand car showroom. There's a pretty old car for quite a high price. The buyer is persuaded to buy it. He doesn't have the money, so he borrows money from what we used to call a finance house, which is not a mainstream bank. It's a kind of secondary level lender, and they're not too fussy about who they lend to. And the car seller's got the forms right there on his desk saying, okay, here's the form, because he's already acting as an agent for the lender. And he's going to get a very substantial commission as well from the lender as a reward for bringing them this customer. So he says, oh, don't worry, you haven't got the money, fill out this form, we'll soon get that loan approved. And I'm not saying they approved every loan, but they approved, they weren't as fussy as your average bank would be. And so assuming the loan went through, then legally speaking, what you end up with is a loan contract where the customer is borrowing money from the lender, the finance house, and a sale of goods contract where he is buying the car from the car seller. Now, if something goes wrong with that car, if it falls to the pieces 100 yards from the showroom, in contract law terms, what have you got? You have got the sale of goods contract for which the customer has loads of rights, presumably because the car is faulty. He's got a loan contract which he is fully committed or fully obliged to honour and repay. And very often we're trying to persuade the car showroom to give redress has proved to be no good, because the car showroom is going to use every trick in the book to resist any claim from the customer, and the lender will simply say, well, it's not our business, that's a separate contract. Privity of contracts, we say in English contract law terms. Privity. private, yes, but it's a privacy means separation. The two don't intermingle. So this act made them intermingle. And they said, not whenever somebody borrows money to buy something, no, but whenever someone borrows money to buy something, and there is a connection, a business connection between the lender of the money and the seller of the goods, which in my example there was, because the seller of the goods is, as I said, he's got the forms already there, he's acting as an agent to introduce business to the lender. So the Act actually talks about pre-existing connections between, whenever you've got a pre-existing connection between the lender and the buyer, the lender and the seller, then you have got yourself a Section 75 situation. And what that says, as I said to you, I promised to put, where possible, the full thing in the slides, so you don't have to look it up somewhere else. This is the key thing. If the debtor, that's the customer, the buyer of the car, has, in relation to a transaction financed by the agreement, that means the credit agreement, the loan agreement, any claim against the supplier, that means the car seller. If the car buyer has got any claim against the car seller in respect of a misrepresentation or breach of contract, he shall have a like claim against the creditor, who's got an identical claim against the lender. You can say to the lender, you've got to pay me for the compensation that arises from the car being no good. Right? I haven't actually said it there, which I should have done really, but you have to have this pre-existing link, which I've already mentioned, between the provider of the loan and the provider of the car. So, if you went to a lender and said, I want to borrow money to buy a car, and he had nothing to do with the car seller, and he lent you money and you use that money to buy the car, this rule would not get triggered, it wouldn't apply. You've got to have that pre-existing nexus connection between the seller of the car and the provider of the loan, which you do in the car seller situation. You know, every single second-hand car seller in the country is going to have an arrangement with a lender of money. He likes that, if only because he earns a commission by providing the business to the lender of money. Okay? Now the only proviso to this, a bit of a weird one, is that the cost of the item being bought must be within this range. Minimum £100, maximum of £30,000. Which in today's money, that being figures from 1974 that have never been updated, would be 1,306 to 391,000. But it hasn't been updated, so you've still got the original sums applicable in the law. Now, that's all sensible. But when did credit cards first make an appearance in the UK? And coincidentally, the answer is about 1974. Barclaycard was the first one ever. So obviously when they drafted this law, they did not have in mind credit cards, because they didn't exist. They were drafting this law in 1972. A white paper called the Crowther Commission report, which did a lot of work that was necessary for this very complicated act. I don't know if you've ever seen Roy Good's multi-volume Law of Credit and Law of Credit and Security or something like that. And it's massive because you've got all these tiny little details in the Consumer Credit Act which merit considerable attention from the lawyers. But most of what's in the Consumer Credit Act is worthy, legally speaking, of great debate and analysis, but it doesn't get it because most consumer loans are so small that no lawyer is prepared to put the time in, or no client is prepared to pay the lawyer to put the time in to analyse the hell out of it. So they don't. But you get, it is a very complicated act, but most of the time nobody gives a damn. And when you've had cases come up, they've generally been pro bono funded cases where senior lawyers have agreed to take it on for no money. And when they do, they generally find that they can find a wrinkle that basically leads to something good for the consumer, which was there all the time and nobody knew it because nobody paid a lawyer enough money to find it. So, when credit cards came in, they set up a system which still applies to this day, which means that the customer gets his credit card. I believe I have one here. Yeah. No, that's a debit card. Customer gets his credit card and he takes it to Sainsbury and he presents it to Sainsbury as payment for his goods. Now when that happens, he is borrowing money from the issuer of the credit card. Right, let's make it £100. He's spending £100 at Sainsbury's. He is borrowing £100 from Halifax, the issuer of the card. Now what does that act say? It says that when you borrow money, and there is an existing link between the seller of the goods and the lender of the money, then you get this joint liability. So is there an existing link between Sainsbury and Halifax? Now this got discussed at great length because you can argue that two ways. You can say, well no, there isn't, because Sainsbury's actually won't deal with Halifax. They'll have their own, what's called in the business, merchant acquirer. Merchant acquirer is the bank that Sainsbury's uses to process all these card payments. So one of the arguments that the banks put up in court is there's no existing link between us and the merchants because we are not the same. But then the counter argument is, well, but then this must be done through some agency arrangement because you're not going to accept a card from someone, you're not going to accept a Halifax card if you've got no arrangements whatsoever to process a Halifax card, obviously. And those arrangements to process a Halifax card must in law constitute an agency. In other words, if Sainsbury's are using RBS as their merchant acquirer, they must be, RBS must be acting as agent for all the individual credit card bank names that gets used, right? It must. And that argument prevailed in court. So you end up with a situation which wasn't intended by Parliament, but we now have that situation that the Consumer Credit Act applies every single time a UK issued card gets used in a transaction that is within this range. Now, most of the time that doesn't matter at all. When it matters is when something reasonably expensive gets bought with a credit card that the customer doesn't get at the time of payment. Let's see how good your thinking is. Give me an example of such a situation. When you use a card, Sainsbury's is not a good example because you're going to walk out with the stuff, right? But when do you use a card and not get anything for a while? Second? Yes, an airplane ticket, correct. There's a classic example, yeah. Now, when are you likely to want to sue pursuant to an airplane ticket purchase? Will it be because the aircraft was no good and it collapsed in a pile of metal, like the car? No. So what might happen that make you be interested in suing the airline? Yes. Or the biggie is they go bankrupt and stop flying altogether, which happens reasonably commonly with airlines. So, when that happens, everyone who's lost their money goes to a consumer credit advisor or online and it says, the first question is, how did you pay for your ticket? And if the answer is credit card, you're in luck. Was it more than £100? Yeah, you're in luck. You'll get all your money back, maybe more than all your money back, from the credit card company because they are jointly and severally liable for the failure to provide claim. Now, if you had to go and, if the original ticket, you being a savvy consumer and you got a ticket for £200, which was a bargain, and then the airline went bankrupt and the same ticket now costs £500, what are your rights? You get the 500 because you need to focus on what is the liability of, you've got to breach your contract, right? The contract was they'll fly you to Los Angeles. They did. Now, what does it cost now? Well, what's their liability? Their liability is whatever the loss arising is. So you want to get to Los Angeles, you can't just grab the first ticket regardless of price. You've got to shop around it. You've got a duty to mitigate, as English law says. You've got a duty to mitigate. When you mitigate, it means shop around a bit. If the best deal you can get is now £500, then that is your loss, and that is what you claim. Now, if the airplane was badly flown and crashed, and it could be proved to be the airline's fault, and you've got a $100 million medical care claim, what are your rights? $100 million, because that is the liability of the airline, and the airline's now gone bust. Bear in mind, the airline doesn't need to go bust because joint liability means equal liability is standing alongside the other party, not standing behind them. Right? Joint liability means the jointly liable person is exactly the same liability as the original guy. You don't have to sue the original guy and lose. You don't have to prove that they're bankrupt. You can just go straight to the jointly liable person, in this case the credit card issuer, and say, I insist that you pay. And they can't say, oh, you've got to ask the other guy first. By the way, they will say that, but legally they can't say that. So we all got used to this from 1974 onwards, and the banks complained, and several times the UK government said, yeah, you're right, we never intended this, we will put in an amendment and get your liability removed for these credit card purchases. And every time they did it, the consumer associations and lobby groups said, whoa, whoa, what's going on here? The bank's favouring their friends in the bank, and so the government's favouring their friends in the banks. And of course the government says to the bank, no, we're not very popular at the moment, we don't want to cause more trouble by passing this act, so sorry, we're going to drop it. And they did drop it, repeatedly. So it's still the law. Now the other thing that happened after 1974 was that people started going abroad a lot more for their holidays. And of course, they frequently spent with their credit cards on their holidays, which the banks were very keen on because they charged a fairly substantial foreign exchange transaction fee of at least 2%, often 3%. So, you know, you spend £100 in Spain and you get £103 on your bill because the bank can levy a foreign exchange charge. And another thing that happened in the 90s, really, 80s and 90s, was an enthusiasm for a type of purchase called a timeshare, which meant that you bought 1 week right to occupy some apartment in Spain or the Canary Islands usually. And these were often ill-advised purchases, and in some cases were outright frauds. There was no timeshare building built at all. And high pressure, typically what would happen is you go on a holiday, say a package holiday to Tenerife, and you'd be notified of a party with free food and drink. You go to this party, and really high pressure sales. I mean, I've never been, but apparently it is just unbearably high pressure salesmanship goes on. And a lot of people were persuaded to buy. And of course, a lot of money, you know, it's £10,000 minimum. So have they got £10,000 in their pocket to buy it, or even 1,000 to put as a deposit? No. So what have they got in their pocket? Yeah? How can they pay? Oh, credit card, that's right. So the credit card gets used to pay a deposit, let's say, and then the timeshare is a complete fraud and never gets built. But in the meantime, this is an interesting wrinkle. The holidaymaker goes back to England and they're told, well, you've got to pay, you paid a 1,000 deposit on your credit card, you've got to pay us another 9,000 balance. And please don't pay that by credit card. They don't want that because they're going to suffer a 5% commission charge by the bank. And so just send that by regular bank payment. So they do. So now the timeshare buyer has lost £10,000, only 1,000 of which is charged to their card. The other 9,000 went out by a bank transfer. How much can he claim under Section 75? 1,000 or 10,000? The answer is 10,000, because once the Act is triggered, once Section 75 is triggered, then you get this joint liability. Joint liability is joint liability. if it's not triggered, then there's zero liability. If, for example, a 99, no, that's not a good example, that'd be wrong. Well, a slightly altered example, if he bought a £99 item, then it's going to, the cardholder will never have any rights under this. But if he buys a £10,000 item, £99 of which was put on his credit card, he's got full rights. Because the cost of the item or service must be this, not the amount that's charged to the card must be that. So for the banks, of course, this is awful. This is terrible. You know, we only processed a blooming £100 charge, and now we're looking at £10,000 liability plus interest. Banks are not happy. But what can they do? Well, they said their liability under Section 75 did not apply when the UK card was used abroad. And the Ombudsman agrees with them. And every time anyone complained to the Ombudsman that they'd spent the money abroad, and the banks always refuse Section 75 liability, the Ombudsman would dismiss the claim and say, no, the banks are right. The law doesn't cover out of UK use of the card. Now, in the end, the Office of Fair Trading took a test case that went all the way to the House of Lords in 2007, and the House of Lords decided that, sorry banks, actually, there is nothing in the Act that says that non-UK transactions are excluded. So poor old banks have to, since 2007, pay up for non-UK use of the card as well as UK use of the card. Any questions? Right, let's move on to the fraud slides then. So, in line with what I said last week, which is the theme of the first set of slides, this is a good example of mishmash UK common law, piecemeal legislation, and it's a mess. And of course, lawyers love a mess, because if it's messy, people don't understand it, and they need to pay a lawyer to get their rights sorted out. So this is why English lawyers do so well. So what are the various rules? Talking about payment card fraud, you can really say internet banking fraud. I mean, internet banking fraud has become not even necessarily internet banking fraud, actually. I mean, but, you know, fraudsters have moved on a lot from fiddling about with cards to much bigger scams that involve confidence tricks and getting people to pay money, not necessarily through the internet, but often is. But let's not neglect the poor old card fraudster. He's still working away, doing his best. So these are the inputs of legal rules, which the lawyer, so if you have a client who says to you, my card got stolen or cloned or whatever, and I've been charged money and my bank won't pay me back, then the lawyer's going to be looking at this range of pieces of law. Now the Banking Code of Business Sourcebook, you may have come across already in this module, well that's a piece of FCA regulation which is not primarily aimed at doing anything other than telling banks how to behave in general terms, as opposed to giving individual rights. But by a backdoor means, they do give individual rights, as we shall see. Then you have the Payment Services Regulations, which are EU law that got passed before Brexit. Then you've got the Consumer Credit Act, which we've already talked about, and you've got the Distance Selling Regulations, which is another piece of EU law that was passed before Brexit. The standards of lending practice are, I just mentioned for the sake of completeness, they are a voluntary code, actually, that are not law, and I don't really say very much, so pretty much ignore them. So what do the fraudsters get up to? Well, CNP fraud, that's where the fraudster gets hold of the details of the card, for example, and uses it on the internet because he doesn't have to show the card. Counterfeit card fraud, that would be a cloned card that's created. Again, knowing the details. Lost and stolen card fraud, obviously that means someone getting your card, or they got your physical card and using it. The main challenge then is how can they get the PIN. ATM fraud, as above, but used at an ATM rather than in a shop. Card ID theft, well, it's pretty much the cloned card example again. Card not received, that's where the card gets intercepted on its way to the genuine customer. And then you've got the scam fraud, I was saying, is the big thing now, where scammers convince the customer of the bank to typically either send money to a safe place or to reveal their password so that the scammer is able to send the money somewhere. And then the older, if you look at the textbooks, it's full of check fraud cases. Fraud is nothing new. I mean, checks were the most wonderful things to do fraud with, because you could alter them, you could sign them on the back and divert them to another party, and they were God's gift to fraudsters back in the day, but of course you don't see many checks now. So, those pieces of law that I said are the distance selling regulations, as the name implies, cover when the transaction is a distance selling transaction. So that mostly the distance selling regulations are about your rights when you use your card to buy something and the thing isn't good enough, and give you rights to cancel and so on. But there's a piece of the distance selling regulations that say when your card gets stolen and used in a distance selling transaction, then you have rights. And so what we're talking about is when the thief uses the stolen card in a distant selling transaction. Now the Consumer Credit Act, again, it wasn't designed this way, so don't ask me the logic of it, because credit cards didn't exist. No cards existed in 1974. Well, the only card they had was something called a check guarantee card, because obviously when you wrote a check to buy something, there were no cards, so, you know, you had to pay cash, or you'd write a check. When you write a check, the seller was saying, no, thank you. You know, how do I know the check's going to be honoured? So the bank issued check guarantee cards, which you could use with a check, and the retailer would write the name of the guarantee, the number of the guarantee card on the back of the check, and that would mean he was guaranteed to get the money. The check would not be bounced, because it had to be less than £30, I think, was the minimum, maximum, right? So there were no cards in 74 when the Consumer Credit Act was passed, but accidentally, just like accidentally it covered that Section 75 scenario, accidentally it covered a stolen card scenario. And again, the bank said this is unfair, and again the government said, sorry guys, that's tough. It's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. Now the Consumer Credit Act, it's a really wonderful piece of legislation, but the worst thing about it is its name, because it doesn't only cover consumer borrowing, and it actually can cover situations even where there's no credit. So you don't need to be a consumer, and you don't need to access credit in order to be covered by the Consumer Credit Act. For example, that Section 75 scenario, if I use my credit card to buy an airline ticket and it gets charged for £200, when I get my statement, if my direct debit pays that statement in full, I don't pay for any credit. You know, I've had credit, I suppose you could say, but it's all been free. But it's still covered by the Consumer Credit Act, because I got a loan. I was granted a loan, even though it was a free, interest-free loan, as it turned out. But the law, because interest-free loans are actually excluded from the Consumer Credit Act. But the wrinkle with this one is that when I use my card, I'm entitled to an extended loan, which will have a pretty high interest rate attached to it. So I can choose. I can either pay the statement when on the due date in full and pay no interest, or I can not pay the statement or not pay it in full, in which case then I will be charged interest. Because I've got the right to either have extended credit that costs me or limited time credit which doesn't cost me, because I've got the right to choose, the law says I'm being granted credit that is regulated by the Act, because it may turn out to be credit that is charged for. So the short version of Consumer Credit Act applicability to plastic cards is it covers credit cards. And it covers ATM cards when the account is overdrawn, either already before the misuse takes place or becomes overdrawn as a result of the misuse. Now, the reason for that is complicated and is not 100% agreed amongst the consumer credit lawyers, but that's basically the main consensus. Everybody's agreed on the credit card applicability. Now, you can have a business account holder of a credit card which is governed by the Consumer Credit Act, because the Consumer Credit Act, as I said, is not limited to consumers. You can have a business account with a credit card issued, and it is considered to be within the Consumer Credit Act, but not a corporate account. If it's a company account, forget it. No way. Now, BCOBS has all these rules. The best I talk about that separately. That's, I think, in the next slide, so we'll move on to that. Oh no, sorry, we got Consumer Credit Act first. I'll do this slide and we'll take a break. So the relevant sections are 83 and 84 of the 74 Act. It's very tough on the banks, very good for the consumers. Only two things can make you liable in respect of fraud on your credit card if it's issued in the UK. One is your agent used it, or strictly speaking, someone who is treated as your agent, which basically means he's your agent. You've said to him, here's my card, here's my PIN number, go and use my card. If you later on complain to the bank, they will quote Section 83 of you and say, no, the person using the card was your agent or acting as such, and you have no rights. The second one is when you've given the card, you've physically given the card to someone, and that person misused it. That means that you, for example, trusted someone to take care of your car while you were going to be away or something on holiday, and the same person you trusted it with misused it. If it gets stolen from the person you gave it to, you're not liable. But if the person who gave it to used it, and it doesn't matter how honest they appear to be, this is not tested by negligence. You could give it to the most homely, religious, virtuous person in the world and say, how am I expected to know they were great bad? You're still liable, because the person you gave it to misused it. If the person you gave it to was horribly negligent with it and just chucked it out of the window into the street, you're not liable. Because it's not a question of whether, not a question of negligence or misbehaviour, it's a question of, did the person you give the card to use the card? If yes, you're liable. If no, you're not. And that's it. End of story on liability with credit cards. Nothing else can make you liable. Note, negligence does not come into this in any shape or form. Agency, you've got giving the card to someone. Now, there have been cases, someone in a restaurant, this doesn't happen so much now because you've got handheld PIN readers, but back in the day, you know, it still happens. The waiter says, how would you like to pay? You say, well, here's my card. He disappears off. And he uses that card to buy stuff for himself. And he charges your card as well, and for your meal, and you get the card back. And, well, you gave that card to him, and he's the one who misused it. Does that mean you've got no redress? Well, actually, probably not, but it's debatable. But the better view seems to be you were only giving, implicitly, you were only giving the waiter permission to take the card to use it for the processing of your meal transaction. And any other uses of the card was not included. But it's never been to court. And it is arguable that, well, the law says you happily gave him the card, that makes you liable. So it's debatable. And the other thing to note is that Once you have told the bank that you lost the card, or that you've given it to someone and you thought better of whether that was a good idea, having read your section 83 of the Consumer Credit Act on holiday, once you've told the bank that you no longer have the card, that draws a line under any liability, line in time. So if the card gets used before you told the bank, you're liable. If the card gets used after you told the bank, you're not liable. And that even covers the fraud scenario. So if you give the card to someone and say, here's my PIN number, go and use it, and before he gets to use it, you think that was a bad idea and you tell the bank to cancel the card, but he does use it, because banks obviously cannot cancel the card instantly. But if you give the card loss notification 1 second before the use of the card, you're not liable. Full stop. Now, that's not the same with debit cards under the other law, but under credit cards, very strong consumer protection ethos, notifying the bank totally terminates any liability instantly, whatever the scenario. And also, this must be noted that despite all that, and going against the consumer is what started off as a £30 liability. It said that the law said that the banks can impose a £30 charge. So if the customer's credit card gets stolen and misused and the bank's got to pay, well, yeah, except they can knock off £30 and say, well, the card was used to the extent of £110, we're only going to pay you 80 because you're liable for the first 30. The way the Act actually expresses it is that that's not automatic, but if the bank wishes to put in a clause in the terms and conditions linked to the card that the card holder is liable for that £30, then they can, and they all did. They rarely applied it in practice, actually, but they all put that clause in. That got lifted to 50 at one point, then it got put down again to 35 under the EU rules that apply to all kinds of plastic card. Now bear in mind that £30, as I said before, would now be actually more. I did that calculation last year, so it would be more than, say, £400 plus. That's what they intended back in 1974. But they didn't index link it, so it just stayed at that same £30 nominal figure, which obviously got devalued by inflation and currency debasement. So, obviously, very often card fraud involves the customer not being present and the card being used in an online transaction of some kind. So very often the distance selling regulations will apply, as well as the Consumer Credit Act. And they wrote into the Consumer Credit Act a provision that says if the customer is protected by the distance selling regs, then the Consumer Credit Act doesn't apply. And that's good for the consumer because the distance selling regs are even more customer friendly and anti-bank than the Consumer Credit Act. And we'll take a break and we'll tell you what they say after the break.
project? It's for finance.
Oh.
It's for the group project.
I mean, yeah, so M&A project, right? And I think like he just comes do his thing.
Yeah.
Like Oxford doesn't care. But what you doing on Thursday?
Nothing.
Because I think on Thursday George told me last week. Mike told us to come again maybe.
For the
there.
tutorial?
No, on Thursday for.
Oh, for the
At this place.
Yeah.
The Arrow. Because we either had a meeting.
Yeah.
Because I saw him on Friday actually.
Yeah, nice.
Saw him on Friday. So he came
Very
with
nice.
us. Yeah. Anyway, and how's your application?
With?
I don't know. You told me like 2 weeks ago you applied somewhere. Law firm.
Oh yeah. No bueno.
No update or
For the vacation schemes, no. But today I actually had a meeting with M&G Capital. They're like an asset management firm
Yeah.
in the UK. It's pretty good. They used to be Prudential before.
Right.
And I'm going to that today at 5 for dinner.
Okay. Well, good luck.
Yeah, I need it.
Yeah. All right.
Cheers,
Yeah.
man. Take it easy.
Bye. I don't know if I just write it just in case. Okay, you have it.
Such a large herd we are the most taxed country in the world. We have gotten higher than Denmark. Denmark used to be the first. It's really bad. No, Denmark used to be one of the worst in that regard, but we got higher than that recently thanks to Macron's government. No, it's really bad. It depends. Taxes on what? Almost everything is taxed. You know there is a tax on taxes. France literally invaded to like, it's really, which is blood. It's so good to know how everything is about. So their taxes on heritage, their taxes on special taxes on cars, and we have like VAT is only 10%, so it's kind of similar in Europe. But yeah, like you have also like social contributions which are very high when you are taxed. You need to capitalize. You need to attach your education about taxes. It's all the same tax, it's all the same rate. Like in Greece, I think around 28% of the population gets income tax because of the income of living so low. And like when you are below the threshold it's really like the countryside. It's really when you are below that you really get cheated off kind of because you cannot really escape like the higher income people, but you are still above all the thresholds that could limit the exposure onto taxation. For instance, that I know that my brother is like super and he earned a lot of money. Very stupid around 4,000 before taxes. It's correct that he did long-term studies. He did a master's degree, and he has really good experience in what he did. And like the state takes almost 60% of his income as taxes between income taxes and social contribution for retirement. That's the minimum salary. But for the situation it makes bad. Quite bad. Like so I have actually my father died. I'm not trying to make this good, so I got a big of interest on that.
There's a whole argument
So we got taxed when you buy it, like non-trading fees are taxes. So we got taxed like 10% of the investment. And when we sell it, except if it's to buy another real estate that you want to live in, you get taxed. I think it was 28%. And when you die, if it's about they did it for such a long time, and nobody is saying anything against it. It's kind of like
A lot of work our
really communist.
I mean, which one?
When like
The M&A you got the same.
Yeah, no, M&A.
more than 55% of the economy is managed by the state,
Actually, one plus.
by local governments. So private
Well,
companies like we are,
I mean, M&A.
Do we have essay or extensive M&A?
think I don't know. It depends on.
Apart from M&A, what else you have? This class, same.
Corporate insolvency.
Okay.
With the same I think the hard.
I'm taking contract law, comparative contract law. Like we study Belgium, Germany, French.
I think for you it's an easy because for the essay you just compare Singapore law and British law.
Yeah.
It's the easy choice. You're cheating, genuinely. Which is the easy part. So you won't be qualified in BCS, but you don't care. You won't stay in teaching.
He was blocked by the
Maybe later in school.
I'm going to SUSS. Have you heard of SUSS? Singapore University of the third law school in Singapore. So we have two law schools, right? NUS, SMU. Then we have the third one, SUSS.
You.
Yeah, a lot. I thought our program is here.
Yeah, I mean, especially in Singapore, because we don't have that much time. But yeah, I mean, I think M&A stuff is like this kind of news. If you take like FinTech, I think like IP, kind of bullshit.
Yeah, but transactional problem you can't choose. Everyone.
Yeah, we can't
choose.
In fact, we should have not
Transactional problem.
Yeah, I really don't care. It's theoretical. It's not practical.
No, because you never take.
No, this is for barrister and professor. See what I mean?
But you never learn all this in France also, right? Architecture.
No, we do a lot of theory. Actually, I'm used to by dissertation in the sense that you can choose either case study with commentary, analysis, or dissertation.
But you will not choose this for you if you can. Transactional problem.
No, I won't. Just another time. I think modules, like every module is about finance, has the best examples. But if you actually want to like go into like just but this is harder than
Yeah, that's why it actually is very key because we already have this, we have contract law, we have my other 15 credit module, and then we still have this transactional problem.
why the audience only have three.
And we are still a dissertation.
Yeah, but I mean the dissertation we are only dissertation. The issue is that we have so many titles in March. So that's the whole issue.
No, the March is a proposal.
It just title.
Yeah, title.
Yeah, I mean just title. And then maybe around the summer is the outline.
December is the full book. The full paper.
No, I said the summer.
Yeah.
Summer is the outline, not the paper.
But you know our supervisor very soon. April, right?
No, me, I won't get professor. I don't want to get that kind of guy. In my field, in my subject, I think there is not a single teacher who is qualified in my supervisor, except either Professor Arner, Douglas Arner, or Professor Walker. If it's not one of them, I'm asking the change.
Professor Ritz.
No, because we have, I saw Professor Ritz yesterday. He had a different talk, and we have them really different perspectives.
In what?
Because, for example, he thinks as a lawyer, you can force you to do things on the technical law, but you cannot. Because I think it's two different roles. It's like you imagine, you a lawyer, you talk lawyer, about car crash and accident. You cannot force the point of view of the law on the mechanism of the car. The car works this way. If you don't understand the car, how it works, how can you assume that you know what it is? You can assume that because you're a lawyer, you can like just put your fingers and see how it is.
You don't agree with you?
He doesn't agree. Because from every technical point of view, the assumption.
But he's more qualified than a lot of professors. He's a judge. Professor Reed.
No, not the judge.
He was a judge.
Not the judge. He was only teacher.
Professor Reed, the one that teaches us is professional.
Oh, better than Reeds.
Yeah, better than Reed.
Oh, you're talking about Reeds, not Reed.
Reed. Yeah, Reed. Professor Reed.
Yeah, yeah. Even Reeds, I mean, he has no clue of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about AI. And I'm going to do the number one citation because all of the other things are really about AI, you don't know what it is. I have my AI coach. I call it this week. I have my own AI. Here, I have my AI assistant. This is my AI assistant. Schedule all my tasks. On my schedule, every contact, schedule my mail.
But did you indicate Professor Walker as your supervisor?
You cannot indicate someone. And that's why Sharon Watson and the other teacher that we did was upset because I think they just didn't like the fact that I already like the first step without their approval. You know?
Sharon Watson, not helpful.
I mean, she's helpful just for the administrative stuff.
Yeah. She's only stopped there.
But she doesn't know the law stuff. I guess you just here to help us solve some administrative.
But she doesn't do anything with you now. We have no business with her.
Yeah, oh, she's doing communication.
Oh, really?
I wanted to send her a mail to have a question about like when do we have a supervisor, and I saw there was like, oh, I'm on annual vacation.
But she said April, right?
April what?
The supervisor.
Yeah, so I really hope I get either Honor or Walker, otherwise I'm not doing the citation with another teacher. I'm not doing it. I swear.
No, they will try to assign someone that is.
And I mean, for example, Walker is most qualified because he already published like 5 books in my field. And it's like Norwegian, no Oxford PhD. I'd rather have someone who graduated from Oxford Region who was a teacher in Oxford. A few years ago, he was still a teacher. So I'd rather have him. Arthur is like also like really qualified. He was Dean of Law of HKU, Hong Kong University, and he's actually a teacher there. Professor Arthur, you know him?
I know him because our class is at information security is at MIT.
Yes. You know, Douglas Arthur is highly qualified. He's a teacher in a lot of units.
What's your topic for dissertation? No, because we are saying that dissertation supervisor. So did Sharon also reply you? It's the what did Sharon also reply you? Did Sharon reply you?
No, I didn't send the mail because when I wanted to send the mail, there was warning. I'm on annual vacation, so I didn't send anything again.
No, but you can send and she can reply you.
Yeah, but I thought maybe I'll
Why you already finished anyway?
No, actually it's too long. Too long. I have like 35,000 words. I need less.
So I have 35 questions.
Oh, it's not like Professor Watson has been. He said you can come to Queen Mary's in my PhD. But I'm like trying to think stuff at Queen Mary's that I maybe better.
Understanding.
Yeah. That's why I asked for Professor Walker because he knows what I'm talking about. I'm not a teacher, he won't know. So like, technical stuff. Yeah, really. Because that's why I want like the last honor, you know, from Douglas. Or because one of them I'm not. I'm actually going in this Bah, en fait, ce qui s'est passé, c'est que nous, normalement, on a des réunions de séparés, tu vois, pour avoir les dissertations. Walter s'est dit clairement, il y a une semaine, il m'a dit, ouais, c'est bon, t'es venu pour moi. Moi, j'ai bien ce candidat, à chaque fois, il me dit, ouais, bah, à chaque fois, demande-moi l'heure si je peux me superviser et tout. Et à chaque fois, il insiste, tu vois. Je me dis ça, bah, j'aurais demandé là. Et quand on a eu l'échange en question sur vous, il me dit, ah ouais, non, mais en fait, vraiment, tu n'as pas le droit de demander comme ça, tu dois faire c'est aléatoire, c'est aléatoire. En fait, ça prend quoi que. Parce que c'est en fait. Ouais, mais surtout si c'est un autre. Parce qu'en fait, ce qui se passe. Ouais, en fait, les deux, les avocats et même en termes de réputation. Avoir comme superviseur un mec qui a fait grand jeu de sport et qui défend dans le sport, c'est un tu vois. Et en plus, attends. En gros, il veut dire que d'abord, c'est aléatoire et puis jamais j'anticipe. Mais laissez-moi, surtout si j'ai son accord en plus, et il me dit, ah ouais, mais en plus, on n'est pas sûr, peut-être qu'il y a beaucoup de travail. C'est lui qui va se. Et le mec lui-même, il m'a dit, j'ai pris 5 millions, normalement, je peux en avoir 4. Arrêtez de. Oui, pas demander à voiture si c'est pas bien. Et après, il faut voir si c'est pas grave. Mais c'est pas grave, d'une manière ou d'une autre, je vais faire Arnaud. Et Arnaud, c'est un grave. Toi, tu es. Oui, on a pas coûté 3 millions. Le mec qui est. Quand il a pris le mec qui prend un grave, à 6 mois. À 2 millions. Oui, le mec, il a un appart. Ouais. En fait, il fait le domaine de cause. C'est pour avoir un mec, voilà, qui est en fait. Moi, quand même, sur les services, c'est bien. En fait, je suis pas bien. N'importe moi, c'est un peu. Non, mais c'est vrai. Mais c'est parfait. Tu sais, on dirait la vidéo, il y a la vidéo, il y a. Il y a la vidéo où tu as gagné les enfants, il y a Ronaldo qui monte le mouvement. Mais c'est ça, tu vois, ça n'a aucun sens. Non, mais c'est. Je sais pas. Les mecs qui sont spécialisés dans ça, c'est des mecs qui sont pas des. Que ce soit bien ou bien, donc c'est des mecs qui ont les mots pour être sûr. Mais tu sais, quand en plus, j'ai pas avec Orphée Michael, et le fait que je ne peux même pas parce que moi, là, moi, j'ai un pro en IA qui colle. Ça veut dire que quand je travaille en IA, les mecs qui nous font ça, en fait, ils forcent l'application droit sur l'IA, enfin, ils essaient de forcer les orientations que sont là, les workers, sur l'IA. Donc, c'est comme si moi, imagine demain, il y a un type hélicoptère sous-marin volant qui apparaît, et il dit, ouais, c'est pas grave, moi, en tant qu'avocat, il n'y a pas de loi dessus, mais je vais dire, allez, c'est un droit des sous-marins. Allez, hop, j'aime. Le mec, en fait, il parle de quelque chose qu'il ne maîtrise pas. Quand tu ne maîtrises pas la technologie et les connaissances juridiques, en fait, il faut maîtriser les deux, c'est ça pour avoir la vie. Parce que moi, ça me fait. Ou alors, tu fais protéger le truc et tu délègues le côté à un mec qui travaille ensemble. Éventuellement. Mais il ne faut pas présenter pour faire l'un. Comme partout, en fait, quand tu vois un gardien, tu ouvres un gardien, tu ouvres un gardien. C'est la même chose. Vraiment, pour le point de vue de la technologie, on ne peut pas dire oui, ils ont juste à lui demander s'ils ont un doute, mais c'est limite. Mais bon, c'est pas grave, de manière ou d'une autre. Bah oui, non, ça va bien pas passer, mais c'est ce que c'est sûr. Oh, le petit ça fait bien chaud quand même. Ouais, ah bah on va en parler.
I've lost access to my. Hello? I've lost access to my slides.
You can just click there. Just click on Google. Google.
No, it doesn't work. Oh, yes, it does. Right. Thank you. Right. So the distance selling regulations. Now this time when they say consumer, which is not in the title of the regulations, but the regulations only apply to consumers, they mean consumer. Anyone who's got a business card is not covered by the regulations. And basically, if someone steals your card and uses it in a distance selling transaction that is not an accepted distance selling transaction, then you are home and dry. There are no exceptions, no provisos. You get your money back. No £35 liability. The only proviso is if your agent used the card, then that would be a problem. But anything but that, no problem. Some distance selling transactions are accepted from the Act. And there's 4 categories. If land was bought, if financial services were bought, if a card was put into a vending machine, like we may have at train stations here, then that would not be a distance selling transaction for the purposes of the distance selling regulations. And you will be back with the Consumer Credit Act. The other thing about the distance selling regulations is they cover all kinds of cards, which the other kind of card that you're likely to use to buy stuff, as opposed to getting cash, is of course the debit card. And the debit card is not covered by the Consumer Credit Act, and the credit cards are, but the DSRs cover both debit and credit cards. So you can see how you've got a nice little tangle of different cards, different laws applying to different kinds of cards, different scenarios, was it distance selling, and so on. You've just got to weave your way through all this tangle of laws and regulations to come up with the right answer.
Professor, I was just wondering, in terms of remedies, is there a difference
In terms of what?
the remedies?
Remedies, yeah.
I was just wondering, would you advise a client, whatever cards, to go for the DSR first or the CCA first?
You've got no choice. As I said before the break, the CCAs got amended when the DSRs came in to say, where the DSRs apply, the CCA does not apply. But as I said, there's no problem because the DSRs are better. And the CCA is almost perfect, but the DSR are even better. Everything else, really, apart from the CCA and the DSRs, are dependent on the gross negligence concept. So if the card holder or whoever is the customer who's suffered from the fraud has been grossly negligent, then he's got himself a big problem. That's the test for pretty much every other law that may cover fraud. Now, BCOBs, I'm not going to go through all the tedious detail of all this, but basically BCOBs, as you probably know, is a set of regulations that the FCA enforce, primarily as a piece of public law. Say, banks, this is what you must and mustn't do with your customers. What kind of customers are covered? Consumers or micro enterprise, defined as in bullet point number 3 there. So small business customers and consumers. Now BCOP says banks can have contracts with customers that throw liability onto the customer up to a maximum of £35 when something like a card, they call it a payment instrument, is lost or stolen. That's not compulsory, that's just saying anything up to that is okay. If banks go further than that, for example, if they say £35 and a penny, then they are in breach of BCOP. That doesn't make the term unenforceable, by the way, as we shall see. But of course, banks will do their best to comply with BCOPs. So, since BCOP says that this is okay, And since they don't want to worry about whether their particular clause is okay or not, they simply cut and paste it into. You look at your terms and conditions, it will almost certainly say something very, very close to that. But they don't have to do that, but it just gives them an easy life for compliance purposes. This VCOM says this is okay, all right, we'll cut and paste that verbatim into the terms and conditions. For customers who are bigger than a micro enterprise, of course, this is irrelevant. And then banks have got much more of a free choice what to put in the terms and conditions. But that's not the important part, of course. The banks don't really care about the £35. What they care about is making the cardholder or the customer liable when for the full amount, which can be hundreds or even thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pounds. So VCOP says, and again the banks are likely to cut and paste this into our contracts, in other words, they're putting a contractual term into their contract with us that says, I will be fully liable if I acted fraudulently or intentionally or with gross negligence failed to comply with my obligations. Or failed to take all reasonable steps to keep my personalised security features safe. So, if the banks cut and paste this into our written terms and conditions, it becomes part of our contract, and then there's your answer. And if you're a lawyer trying to work out liability on this, you can't just say, well, VCOP says this, because it's not the law as such. You have to say, well, let's have a look at the terms and conditions, but what you're very likely to find is this, because they've done a cut and paste job. Now, VCOPS doesn't say what your obligations are. Well, it says a couple of examples, but they don't go into full, because VCOPS is really trying to say what the bank should be doing and not doing, and not what the customers should be doing and not doing. And this one is saying the customer can be made liable in full if he didn't comply with his obligation. It doesn't quite say that. What it says is if he intentionally or with gross negligence failed to comply with his obligations or failed to keep his personalised security features safe. What does that mean? Passwords, PIN numbers.
What about if you go out to the cafe and the Wi-Fi is not strong? I think cybersecurity, we see that hackers could also hack through the Wi-Fi system. Is it considered taking reasonable steps if it's in a cafe or Wi-Fi?
So what you're saying, you're using the internet and the Wi-Fi in the cafe and it's not secure?
You won't know, right? But the hackers hack through the Wi-Fi.
Well, I mean, conceivably it comes within intentionally or with gross negligence failing to take all reasonable steps to keep your security features safe. Right? Because you could say keying in the password is well, I mean, lots of things about the password needs to be of a reasonably secure standard, and then you need to keep it private. If you know someone is looking over your shoulder when you're keying it in, then you have failed to take all reasonable steps, arguably. Obviously, this is, I mean, all you can say is that this is the law, or this is, as I said, likely to be the law because it's been cut and pasted into the contract. And then you have to listen to the story that you hear and apply this to the story that you hear. And very often it doesn't come up with a clear yes or no. but note that what it's saying, everything is qualified by the intentionality or the gross negligence. So you can, and you've got a weird thing here because you've got reasonable steps here, but that's not enough. You've got to fail to take reasonable steps with gross negligence, which is also about reasonableness, obviously, because that's what negligence means. But that time it's gross, so they put in a double negligence on one. It starts off with being a very strong test, and then it weakens down into just plain reasonable. Very bizarre. I mean, they didn't think this through very well. And then you've got the intentionality thing. Well, what do they mean by that? If they say if you intentionally broke your obligations, does that mean that you knew what the obligations were and broke them? So if you didn't know what the obligations were, you'd be all right? Or does it mean whether you knew what the obligations were or not, you intentionally did whatever it was, such as letting someone see your password? Again, that's unclear, but what you can say is that most of the time intentionality isn't the point. Most of the time gross negligence is the point, and that's much more easy to determine because it's obviously an objective test. It doesn't matter what the individual customer was thinking or doing, or thinking about what he was doing. It is about what does the average person think about what he did. That's much more easy a test to apply. What this means in practice, of course, in terms of the plastic cards, is that with most credit cards, this doesn't apply because you've got the far more consumer-friendly Consumer Credit Act, or DSRs. But if it's a debit card and the DSRs don't apply, then you're into this realm of basically gross negligence. And the same £35, by the way. Even if you weren't grossing negligent, you still got a £35 liability. So this slide is exploring some concepts about, can you argue on behalf of a client that if the bank is saying, well, we said in our terms and conditions that you shouldn't do this or that, for example, write down your password, and let's say you did, but you did it in a disguised form, and it wasn't really the cause of the loss anyway. But the bank tries to say, well, because you wrote it down, though, you've been grossly negligent and you're liable. So then you can try to bring in the CRA unfair terms rules that was in the first set of slides, and argue that these banks' terms are too severe under the CRA, and therefore unlawful. So there's a lot of scope for, even if you appear to have lost on the fact, there's a lot of scope for broad thinking. Is there any way I can get around this to attack from a different angle? Now, under the BCOBS rules, notifying the bank helps, but not as much as it helps under the CCA. So under BCOBS, if you've been fraudulent and then you change your mind and you notify the bank that you've lost the card or given the card to someone, doesn't help. You're going to be liable even if you got the notification in before the car was misused, unlike the CCA where it's different. Obviously, if you lose your card or it gets stolen, you really hope that the thief uses it in a distant selling transaction that is not an accepted contract, because if it's a debit card, that makes a big difference. If it's a credit card, it doesn't make much difference, but with a credit card, the protection you're going to get under DSRs is a lot better than what you're going to get under BCOBs. Or the PSRs, as I shall say in a minute. So this is the point, the cut and pasting point that I've already made. Yeah, the point I'm making here is that if the banks have been a naughty boy and they put in terms and conditions which are too strong under the BCOBs rules, then what happens? Well, you know, BCOBs doesn't make this void for criminality. If they put in a clause that says you're liable under certain circumstances and they shouldn't have put that clause in, well, you know, you've got an interesting situation because that clause is still valid in contract. It's just that they could be penalised by the FCA for putting in a clause that's too strong. But it's still a valid clause. One would suspect that a court would say, they'd find a way somehow saying that the clause is invalid, but it's arguable that it's still valid. But even then, you could, even if that happened, then of course, if you're a private person, which means not a company, then you can make a claim under 138D that the clause which was contrary to BCOBs caused you loss because you were made liable in a situation which you shouldn't have been, and then you could sue them back again. No, they sue you basically. They say you're liable for the loss, fraud loss. And you say, well, yeah, but I'm going to claim that back again against the bank for not complying with BCOBs, and Section 138B2 gives me a remedy for that. You can see how complicated it can get. Well, the PSRs say something very similar to all this. The PSRs say for example, bullet point number 3, customer must take all reasonable steps to keep safe his personalised security credentials. Very similar to what we just saw in BCOBs. So I'm not going to talk much about PSRs because it's basically the same story as BCOBs, except that it's not a cut and paste issue this time. It is PSRs are the law. And they also apply to all level of businesses. They're not limited to the micro enterprise. So you could say that PSRs benefit everybody, but the level of benefit is not very good because it's only gross negligence level, and that's not great. Yeah, so Regulation 77 says, this is PSR, Payment Services Regulation 77, says if the customer has acted fraudulently, then he will be liable, no ifs or buts. So it's worth looking for a minute, what does fraud mean? It's defined in law by the Fraud Act 2006. The big thing about fraud is it requires dishonesty. So just because you've lied about something, and just because you've gained a monetary advantage by lying about something, doesn't make you fraudulent. Fraudulent means, fraudulent in law has to include the compulsory element of dishonesty. a dishonesty is very loosely defined. It's basically what ordinary people think is dishonest, which is why we have these wonderful juries in criminal trials, which David Lang is trying to get rid of, because you're asking a question of dishonesty. It's not a legal question. Well, it is a legal question, but the decision on whether something's been dishonest or not is up to the ordinary guy or girl viewer. The judge cannot tell the jury this was dishonest. He has to leave it up to the jury every time. So if you've done criminal law, English criminal law, then you'll know all this. So bullet point number 2, you look, what was the actual state of knowledge of the defendant and what did he believe were the facts? Now if he believed the wrong facts, you have to let him believe the wrong facts, assuming you believe that he believed the wrong facts. You know, not just trying to kid you. But having decided what he perceived as the facts, you say, well, now we shift to the objective test and say, well, what would the ordinary person have thought of his behaviour given those facts that he believed? I always like to give a homicide example of this. If you see a man in a suit, in a bear suit, walking down the street, and you think it's a bear, and you kill it, but it's really a man in a bear suit, you know, the question for the law is going to be, well, do they believe, you know, does the jury believe that you didn't think it was a man? If they think you're trying it on, obviously you lose, but if they genuinely, if they believe that you genuinely but wrongly thought it was a man, sorry, if they believe that you believed genuinely that it was a real bear, not a man, then you can't be guilty of homicide because your intention was not to kill a human being. So it's the same thing, but in the dishonesty context. Here, dream up whatever scenario you like. The guy could say, well, I didn't think this situation was a fraud, and you know, the jury has to decide do they believe him or not. And in a civil trial, well, of course, it's different. In a civil trial, it's not on beyond reasonable doubt, it's on a matter of the balance of probabilities. So that's why A.J. Simpson, you know, lost in the civil trial, but won in the criminal trial because it's a higher test than applied in the criminal case. Are they really sure that he intended to kill that guy? And in the civil cases, is it more likely than not that he killed the guy? I mean, that's a very different level of test. And the same thing happened with Mike Lynch recently, the guy who tragically died on the yacht off the coast of Sicily. And then he sold his company called Autonomy for billions of dollars to Hewlett Packard. And Hewlett Packard were prepared to pay a very high price because they believed Autonomy was making most of its money from selling software as opposed to hardware. Everybody knew there was money in selling software, but no money in selling hardware. So he allegedly fixed the figures to make it look like the company was making more money from selling software than hardware. And Hewlett Packard didn't do their due diligence and believed it and paid far too much. So then Mike Lynch and the main accountant got prosecuted in the criminal courts in California, and they got off because it's a beyond reasonable doubt test, and they were given the benefit of the doubt. But they were sued in the civil court in England, and the High court found that they were liable because they're applying a balance of probabilities. Right. Yeah, dishonesty, of course, is not a required element for gross negligence. You can be the wrong side of gross negligence without any shape or form or hint of dishonesty. So this, you'll recognise a lot of this from what we said about B-cubs, like the last point, fails to take all reasonable steps to keep its personalised security features safe. So what can we say about gross negligence? It's negligence obviously is a massively well litigated and defined test expression in English civil law. Donahue and Stevenson and so on. But gross negligence doesn't feature much in civil law. It does feature in criminal law because you can be liable for manslaughter if you kill someone having been grossly negligent. And you've got the, this Adamaco case that went to the House of Lords in 95. I think that was a doctor who caused the death of a patient from memory. So how do they test it in the criminal law? Well, they say it's behaviour so bad that it should be judged as criminal. Well, that doesn't really help us in defining what does it mean in terms of credit card fraud or internet fraud. And anyway, we're talking about civil liability here, so it doesn't really fit to say you're civilly liable if you did something so bad that it should be criminal. Well, hold on, this isn't about criminality. So, next few slides trawl through a lot of the cases, and there aren't many, and what the judges said. And some of the judges say it's exactly the same thing as ordinary negligence, it's no different, which doesn't seem right. Gross negligence as a contractual term does often get written into contracts. So courts have had to apply, courts have had to decide who's liable when gross negligence has been written into a contract. In other words, the contract says one party will be liable if he's been grossly negligent. That's not liable because he's been grossly negligent under the law, that's because it's written into the contract as something that makes you liable. But the court still has to decide what it means. Probably the better cases have decided that it means something much more stringent than ordinary negligence. In other words, you can be negligent up to the ordinary level and not be liable. You have to be negligent to a worse level in order to be liable under the gross negligence test. So these are the cases, not necessary that you read them all. Because they're not banking law cases, they're cases on how do we decide what gross negligence means. But they don't really give you an answer, they just say, well, it's, most of them say, well, it's a higher standard than ordinary negligence, but they don't say how much higher. They do say that it includes recklessness. They do say that if someone has been reckless as to the consequences of their actions, then that can be gross negligence. So that leads us up to the big area that has become the massively litigated APP fraud area, which I'm pretty much going to save for tomorrow. Sorry, next week, not tomorrow. What else can I do today? Yeah, got quite a lot of slides on this. Several cases. I read another one this morning that was decided in November, called some TV company. Another very complicated case. Here's an interesting example. That this is one of the APP or QuintScare cases, but this is where JP Morgan was doing banking services for the government of Nigeria, and at the beginning of the contract, when they were drawn up the terms and conditions, JP Morgan said, we'll only be liable if we have been grossly negligent. And that was written into the contract. So then when they did something that the Nigerian government thought was wrong, JP Morgan said, well, regardless of what the law says about whether we're right or wrong, the contract says we're only liable if we've been grossly negligent. And so, in other words, that will save us from liability under the normal law, because the contract has pushed the liability hurdle to a higher level, you know, and the court said, yeah, that's right. You know, of course, we're not talking about consumer, we're talking about the government of Nigeria, so that's not a widows and orphans situation. It's a major party that can take care of itself, so there's no suggestion that it's been term that's been forced onto a weaker party. But given that, you know, you follow the contract. Now, I would suggest that you read some of these cases. The Philip is the obvious one. Now, actually, the first level to approach this is probably a good one, is to look at the kind of one-pager summaries you get from the law firms and the barristers' chambers. So if you just Google the name of a case like Barclays Bank and Philip, you'll quickly come across a bunch of these summaries. And that's a good way to start, because they tell you the basic summary of what the judgment decided. And then it's up to you how deeply you take it. I mean, I would like to think that I can tell in your exam answer how deeply you took it, or how, more accurately, how well you have used the depth that you've taken your knowledge to. And all this makes me, I was thinking about this today, you know, it depends what kind of lawyer you want to be, really. Because if you want to be a commercial lawyer, you've got to love reading this stuff. You know, if you talk to guys in the chambers at three-bedroom buildings and brick court and so on, you know, those guys spend 90% of their time just reading stuff like those cases. And when they get instructed in a really big case that goes all the way up Court of Appeal or even Supreme Court, they have to live and breathe that case, and they have to become utterly familiar with every single possible little wrinkle that is in all the other cases. Now that's a very different kind of lawyer to if you're a trial lawyer, like Rumpole or Bailey, you know, and you're doing that kind of, you won't catch him reading a law report in a million years. You know, it's all about the cut and thrust of the court everybody knows what the law is. It's evidential. You're trying to tell the jury the guy didn't do this or that. The law's pretty much, if it's murder, did he kill him? Did he mean to kill him? You don't need to read a bunch of cases to do that kind of law. So you've got to decide, are you the kind of lawyer who likes to read a lot of stuff? Because you're going to have to read a lot of stuff. You do banking law or commercial law, that's what it's about. You won't be in court much. I did pupillage with a tax lawyer for 6 months, and we spent 1 day in court. 1 day in 6 months. It's all about opinions. In those days that they didn't have the internet, he went everywhere with what they call the yellow book, which is the old Butterworth tax legislation. And every time somebody asked a question, you open the book at the right page and have a look again. What did the statute exactly say about that particular point? Not so much about reading cases unless a trial is coming up. It was really just about giving opinions on complicated tax scenarios. Very little cut and thrust of court work. So it's worth, my advice to you is, have a think about what kind of law do you really want to do. They're very different jobs, very different. In England, anyway, in some countries, and I'm familiar with some other jurisdictions, there basically isn't much law. And the lawyers there are just going to kind of process documents and motorize stuff, and there are no cases to read. And the English law is just full of it. It's just, as I was saying last week, it's dangerously overloaded with cases and articles and stuff. Now, anything else I can cover today? Yeah, stack of cases on this. So, the other thing I would strongly recommend is you read some of the more recent articles. So you go right to the last slide. Now these will be very well worth reading, because instead of a 50-page judgment, you've got a 5-page article on the judgment. It's usually very well written by a quality lawyer, so that's another good way of approaching it. I think, yeah, all five of the articles on that page. The fourth one's not on the fraud point, that's on the point of, I mentioned last week, that's also had an important case recently of, can someone self-certify their ability to consider themselves a sophisticated investor? And this professor from LSE said he was, and he probably wasn't. And the financial services firm took his money and lost part of it in a year. And when he complained to the ombudsman said to the firm, well, you should have not just taken his word for being a sophisticated investor, you should have investigated a little bit whether he really was, and so he got his money back. That's what that fourth one is about, which is also very important, but it's obviously different from the Philip fraud scenarios. Yeah, that one again, you could read all of them. They're recent, apart from the last one. Yeah, so the slides, the articles in the last 3 slides, I would commend to you, not that top one there, because that's a different point. Good title. English judges prefer bankers to nuns. Yeah, so all this is about Quint's care, basically, because I'm going to get pretty technical next week. So if you've done some reading on that area, then it will make it work a lot better. Any questions before we finish today? Okay, see you next week. You've all got this code, have you? Oh, it is. Right.
J'ai vraiment été désigné d'informaticien. C'est incroyable.
Ah, c'est le professeur qui m'a demandé. Non, c'est le professeur Walker qui m'a demandé.
Après, c'est bien encore une fois, écoute, ça te fera une raison de plus de lui demander qui te prennent pour la thèse. Ouais, c'est une thèse, c'est pas un mémoire.
Non, c'est le mémoire, mais c'est les deux. Je peux déjà faire. Moi, j'ai les publications, je les ai de continuité. Hein.
C'est bien stylé.
he goes home, he's gonna be like, okay, so why so? And I'm like,
You don't gossip. The thing is, you like forget it. So, for example, you don't like gossip. Just say, oh shit. It doesn't turn that. You just feel like I say. I tell her everything happens in my life. And I cannot tell you everything that happens. We're not at the end. Like I say, what we are doing wrong was after it was this bad PR kind of made you know. But he thinks otherwise. Actually, that was what he did. He didn't tell you. I definitely, I think he knows wrong. So it's wrong. We're just like, oh, it's not your bad PR. It's not his bad PR. I was like, I think he did a bad job.
His bad PR was horrible.
I know exactly that was it. Because I actually said, I'm going to do someone who they got, who considered the people of the life. Each like mentioned that, like, yeah, I said,
But since the beginning, he's done the worst PR that he could have done.
I said so. I don't know how to say it, but he takes otherwise. That's what
Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel.
that's what
How you guys?
I say.
You guys
Like,
have to be busy, guys.
spoke about.
What are you guys? The what?
We have our favorite spots. I don't know why I laugh at that actually. Like, I didn't know people would say like it's good. But I think it's good.
Well, have you used this? It is not pretty, right?
I think that's like about hair.
I was going to ask how your project is doing. How's it going?
Okay, Emma, you know that.
On Thursday. This Thursday.
What do you mean? I say guilt.
Yeah. So looks like they've been saying
That's not true.
it's just to go. You have mine. Because I don't they're also going to what you do, right? Trying to replicate it.
I kind of
I think it should be fun. But don't worry, you ace it. Okay. It's giving a I can actually do it. But it's your skill. Let me check, doesn't check. What are you gonna do about it? You know what I think? Genuinely, I think you're a nice guy. You're a very, very nice guy. But if someone said to me, do you want to be in a relationship with me? I would say no. Because still deciding. I might do my last January 8 because I want to give myself time. Like I'm going to do the course in September. I'm going to spend when I finish that at least 6 months. When I finish it, I'm going to spend the main whole time just building up my confidence and I'm not sure sort of like working in a bar just to get nice coffee. This is going to be so I don't know. Yeah, I'm kind of leaving up that. I feel like I will try to film class. I'll give myself a year to do. I would say also, because all my friends, she literally passed the first time. She said, do the questions. Just keep doing it every single time. And that's what I did for my first time. Like the multi choice as well. You keep going. She said to me also that like the exam questions, like the mock questions, is completely different. Some of it is when you start it, you're like, wow, I've never done this question before. But it's all right. You have like some sort of like following towards it. But then towards the end, you find questions that you've done before. It's very interesting. I have a question. So, what is that smell? That fake smell?
Yes, when I walked out, that time, reception was like,
Because it smells nice. I'm like, is there like a food area here? Because I don't know.
when I'm walking in, so I was like,
It's nice. Not for me. It's like it's like a 20-minute drive. Where? More northeast, so it's fine for me. Oh. At the same time. Is the exam time? Is that what it is? Oh, from midnight to 12.
Yeah, no, I won't be able to do it because I just got the exam was time to sit. Like you know, we did the World Economics. It's
Oh, okay. It's hard. You can do the numbers of all.
well then. Are you sure? That's 100% certain. The exam might be different.
He does exactly.
Can I ask this?
He has what's the exam?
Is the exam for banking and fintech timed, or can I hand it in whenever I want?
No, in this time you have like 24 hours.
Okay, but this one, not your other exams with me. This exam.
It's 24 hours. It follows the same structure. Every one of these courses has the same structure. Yeah, but it makes no sense. You can just give however long you want and you will expect the same answer. It's not that you could use AI just because you have a lot more time. It's not going to change. Yeah, it is.
Because I have a wedding on Monday. I'm a bridesmaid.
I would say just read the question before the wedding, so that maybe you don't have it in your mind, you kind of you know which question you're going to do. Because you don't know how that is.
Okay, I'll tell the parent then. I'll be like, girl, we come to a wedding.
What I did was that I just focused on 3 areas, and I'm pretty sure you did that as well. Just focus on 3 areas you're good at, and then the professors will base on that. And then don't stress too much. Don't think that just because you have a lot of material you're going to screw it up. But just focus on a few materials, just 1 or 2 per chapter is all you need. So if you just like 3 different pages, then that's more than sufficient.
Yeah, I would say choose because he gives the list like time tech, rent tech, tech, pay tech, like in all that list of the 6 subjects that he gave, choose 3, focus on the 3, and the rest you can. Don't do that.
So,
I can give you the list if you want.
yeah. Can I get your number? I could have hit it from this side. I wanted to this side. So
There you go.
what's your name?
Elena. Yeah.
Bank. What the hell is this? Why is this stitching? Thank you. Well, it looks like it's
The list is quite long.
Let me see the list. Where did he send it?
I don't know, he said it's yours.
So that's the way you know.
FinTech,
And then you pick whichever one you want to do.
there will be a question on each of this.
Exactly. So I just focused on 3 and studied that mostly.
And like, all usually, whoever the class that you look, we always kind of goes the same.
It's the same structure and same question paper.
It just changes sometimes when people use a bit more of that area rather than that area. It's usually around the same area.
Also, by the way, this can manage target in two one. So if you just want to do one, then you can specify
Yeah.
that. But if you want more than two,
Yeah, I wouldn't definitely tell us. But also, we moved from NS from the exam in January.
they were pretty hard. Like,
You had no use for me for probably like 25 hours after you did this because I had a back-to-back 24 hours. So it was hell of a day. The next day. But yeah, no, so I would say focus on 3. Obviously, you can do ethics, but I would say ethics is the most, well, hard one. Because of it, pure beliefs. And if you don't have beliefs, then you don't argue well enough. So I would say don't focus on ethics, focus on your feelings. Like I feel like we feel more confident about it because we have already the test exam in there. So is it just stressful? Like you don't just sit thesis.
I just don't understand.
No, I wouldn't advise it.
And also she said that if you don't have the same lower stamp counts
Yeah.
same ethics,
You're less likely to
yeah.
Score better.
like you can get a high score if you argue it well. But it doesn't go well for like you know when you make arguments properly. But that's any question that's like because of X.
I'm gonna go. It was lovely seeing you.
And the thing
Bye.
is, I
So your lecture is starting soon.
See you guys next week.
mine's
Are you guys
starting at 4.
starting at 4?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, they're giving us like an hour's worth of the day.
Are you guys going to the tutorial tomorrow? What time is yours?
Well, but it's a short one.
No, it's not joint. I have mine at 2, but the thing is that the guy just treats it as a 2-hour class,
Yeah.
and then for the entire duration, it just keeps going on and on. And if you come in like an hour late, it'll just be like too much talk of the class.
Yeah, that's why I really like
When you just know that if you come in at 1, it doesn't make much of a difference.
What is it the same place?
yes, so
It is at the same time.
it's definitely not allowed.
Yeah.
But for
Because
him, the structure, way he structures his course is that it's just that if you aren't there at the moment it starts the lecture, then you're not going to be able to
So how about 1 stay till 3?
yeah.
till 3, yeah.
Bye. Don't come this downstairs.
Sorry?
Don't come this downstairs.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want me to wait?
You voting for anyone? Are you voting for anyone? Voting.
Right, good. No, I voted for one guy that I made that I've done tax with before. But I haven't voted for anyone.
There's so much politics, and I don't want to vote for anyone. Just like I'm not voting for anything. All of my friends are telling me saying vote for this guy, vote for this guy. I'm not voting for anyone. Some guy even yesterday called me and he was like pretty adamant with telling me to vote for the things that means ask me the girl that I told you about.
Wait, can you see picture?
Yeah.
I love it. Wait, you sure you're not seeing anyone?
I mean, I have someone that I'm in a conversation with, but I'm just
Nothing to tell about yet. I'm excited to hear more about it.
just about her yesterday because I got
Oh, I know her! I've seen her.
student and now it's like pretty pissed when my friends called me up and then she's like standing right beside them because there was they were asking him to get me to vote for her. Like I should have like feelings for her or something. I'm not gonna vote for her. That's it.
That's annoying. I feel like I just voted for you guys because I was like, oh, you asked me to vote for him. I don't think vote for him. So last year, for my orgy, I was one vocal and you obviously everyone that was going for everything. And now it's so political. Like people would vote for someone to vote against another vote. It was so hilarious. One girl, because he was a sports tech, obviously. And obviously sports tech was the one that we cared the most about as being like a football club and all that. So we hired my football team and football club went for that position. None of them voted because